Greetings and welcome back to Pixorama, where today I'm feeling a little... I'm sorry, I meant to say I'm feeling a little... You know what? We're having some slight technical difficulties, so give us a second and we'll be right back. I'm alright, nobody panic, I'm alright. Am I alright? Yes I am. Okay, haha, let's get on with it. In today's episode, I thought we would create a little cute robot sprite and then animate it. We're not going to do anything too crazy. I thought an idle animation would fit the bill pretty well, but I thought it would be cool to see the process from pile of pixels to finished animation. So, journey with me as we bring this little bucket of bolts to life.
Once again, as many times before, we're gonna start in A-Sprite by creating a canvas of 96 by 96 pixels.
After which, we are going to load a color palette. And I happen to have one prepared here. Well, actually I have two prepared here. But I'm going to choose the one I feel is going to be more appropriate, and in this case, it's the more colorful one. As usual, some preliminary document preparation will then proceed, such as filling in the background with a nice shade of white. I'll label that layer and create a new layer and call it Robot, and then we'll get right to it and start sketching out the shape of this little mechanical monstrosity. No, I shouldn't be that mean to him, he's a nice little fellow. So I'm going to start by tracing out the shape of the head, and in my imaginings I kind of had the idea of giving him a head shaped like an old retro monitor. No, that's not what I was envisioning. Yes, well, that's much closer. I like the look of that. So, that's what he's gonna get for his little noggin. And at the moment, I'm not really worrying too much about colors or even really the line work. I'm just trying to get the rough shape out, something that I think is kind of close to what I imagined, after which I'll start detailing. I'm going to give him a small panel where the eyes are going to go, and at this point I realize I might not have the colors necessary for the eyes that I want, so I'm actually going to add a new shade here, and to do that you go down and choose a color that you would like, and click on this little exclamation mark which says Add Foreground Color to the palette. Once you do that, it will appear in the palette, and to move colors around in A-Sprite, I had to actually look up how to do this. Basically, you click on a color, and then click on the yellow outline, and then you can shift it around and even delete it. So you'll see me rearranging this palette quite a bit, and you'll also see me adding a few colors as we go along. That is the magic of creativity. You never really know what you're going to need until you need it. However, fear not, for the final palette with my final choices will be available, as I said, below in the description. Just click the link and download it to have fun with color. As you can see, the head is now taking shape quite rapidly, and I'm starting to get very detail-y because the form that I want is kind of there now. It will, of course, go through some more tweaking, but basically that's how it's gonna look. I've also added some little mechanical ears before starting on the body. Now, I will say that at the beginning I had different ideas for this sprite than how it actually turned out. For example, I wanted the clothing to kind of have a Japanese-style flair, so you can see that I've given him sandals with socks, and also a kind of haori-style top, and an obi belt. But this is not how the sprite ends up looking, so bear with me as things change, but I'm just sort of experimenting here, and I do run through a fair amount of permutations before deciding, no, this is not what I want. Actually, what I really want is for the robot to look more robotic, and in the end I will just change it completely. Onto something a little more exciting and different. I really wanted this robot to have kind of a tropical aspect to him, and what better way to give tropical aspects to someone than by making their hairdo a tropical plant puff. As the smash hit J-pop banger has it, I've got tropical plants on my head, and I don't suffer no fools. I got plants on my head, and I don't suffer no fools. Yeah, the 90s were a very special time for music indeed. Now, I'd just like to slow down for a second and zoom in on the plant puff here, and talk about what I'm doing in the shadows. You'll notice that I have used a purple shade for the shadows here, instead of a shade of green that is darker than, the others. I'm doing this for two reasons. One is to add a bit of interest, and second of all, because I don't actually employ the concept of hue shifting in my work often enough. What is hue shifting, you might ask? Well, there are plenty of far more talented pixel artists on YouTube who have done videos on exactly that topic, and I will link a particularly good one in the description below, done by Brandon James Greer, which I absolutely love. If you haven't already, I would highly suggest that you subscribe to his channel because he does fantastic pixel art content. Now, in the future, I might also do a video on hue shifting as well. It would be a cool topic to cover. But the basic premise is that when you're adding colors to your palette in pixel art, and you want darker and lighter shades, you don't just add brightness to the colors, which kind of results in a washed out look, but you shift the colors in hue as you move them towards either being lighter or darker. And this results in a far more pleasing image with some beautiful, vibrant colors. Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna do a video on this in the future here because I think it's worth discussing on Pixorama. Back to our little robot, and you can tell that at this point I've decided to change the body as preluded earlier. I'm going to give it a more mechanical, robotic-looking body, which seems to make sense. And the first addition, after completely redrawing him, is to give him this nice little chest plate monitor, after which I'm going to adjust his abdomen, I suppose, and make that more mechanical-looking, kind of more like a piston sort of device. As you can see, his arms have also received a makeover. Gone are those little hands, and instead I've given him some little robotic mitts. I think I will adjust his stature because he's looking a little too tall for my liking, and then I will start shading in some of these details and shaving off a few pixels here and there. I also feel like the hands need more work, so I'm going to extend them down, add a little highlight color to give the impression that he's got some sort of digits there, thumb or perhaps fingers, and give them some undershadowing as well. And make the feet, I know they kind of look like hamburgers, I sort of envision them having sort of spring-like devices inside them. So you can see now that the body has changed quite a lot from our original design. I think this new form is far more fitting, and it's just one of those things that happens while you're designing something. Of course, I had envisioned this little character in my head beforehand, but things often change while you're working, and I think usually they change for the better. I am liking where this sprite is at. I feel like at this point I can move into some of the final detailing, which involves removing some of these awkward black outlines and just polishing him up as much as possible before we move into the exciting part, which is bringing him to life, as it were. Yes. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to remove some of these outlines, and to do that, all I'm going to do is simply replace them with the applicable shade. So I want to keep the form, but I want to change the outlines into something that looks a bit nicer. I'm going to add some shininess to the metal, because I feel like he has a nice shiny metal head, and I'm going to add a little more shadowing detail. Oh, gadzooks, did I just change that back to that shade of green again? Well, so much for that hue shifting bit. You're a liar! Anyway, let's change topic. With this sprite, I feel like the light source is on the top left of the scene. It's coming down from the top left onto the character. And it's almost creating kind of a rim light effect, so any surfaces that are facing diagonally or to the sides are going to catch this light, like on his head there up in the top left. Now, one fantastic feature of Sprite, and there are so many of them, is the ability to check your document for unused colors in your color palette. Pixel art is, of course, always about color economy, and we want to have the least amount of colors possible to keep track of and to work with. So by clicking this option, select unused colors, it will do just that in your palette, and from there you can either replace them or delete them and clean things up to your liking. I feel that the head needs a little more definition, so I'm just going to go around the outsides and draw some highlights on these edges, which tends to give the shape a sharper appearance, which I think looks quite snazzy. But just to make certain that I've made the right decision, I often toggle back and forth between an older version and the newest version, which I've placed on different frames. And yes, this is looking much nicer, I believe. The colors also have changed a bit, they're more vibrant and a bit more saturated, and a little lighter. So that's all looking quite nice. Now, there's something I do want to adjust quickly going forward, and that is the tropical foliage atop this little robot's head. Just removing some of those black outlines, as I mentioned earlier, and working on the shadow detailing, using one of my favorite methods, which I've talked about quite often, this pixel sort of diffusion method, which saves you colors and adds quite a lot of detail. Snazzy. But looking at him now, I also find I don't like the ears, so I'm going to change them and make these little ear modules something a little kind of cooler looking. Give them some futuristic looking glowing neon circles, because that's the kind of era he's from, I suppose. Finally, there are just a few places that I think could use a little more shadow detail on his little abdomen down there, the little springy abdomen, and also his face is looking like it could use a little more personality, so I'm going to add some final shading there as well, just to give his faceplate a bit of depth. Touch up the highlights on the edges, give his eyes sort of almost a luminous, kind of glassy, glowing kind of quality. And I did actually toy with the idea of putting a layer of pixels around the outside of the eyes to make them glow, to give them this kind of glowy effect, but I figured it would look too muddy, and I actually really liked the clarity and the sharpness of this yellow shade on this almost dark black color. So it's funny though, putting a little shadow on the inside of the eyes upside down tends to give it this odd sort of neon quality, as if the eyes are actually illuminated. I got a little sidetracked at this point because I was kind of excited at having finished the sprite and created a border, but that's not important, because what we're going to do right now is hide that border and create a new layer which is going to contain our animation. Joy, happy day. So I'm going to copy our sprite, plonk it on this new layer, call it Robot Idle, and let's get to the animating. Before I even begin this, I want to have an idea of what's going to happen in my head, and what I want to happen is for the robot to bounce in place and actually spring upwards. So his idle animation is literally going to be him standing there bouncing on the spot. And for this, we require that he first buckles down a little bit and gets ready to spring upwards. So the first frame is going to be him lowering slightly, after which we are going to have him propel upwards. So all I'm going to do is copy the initial sprite, paste it on a new layer, and start adjusting things bit by bit, which is how animation tends to work. And I'm going to get this springing motion in straight off the bat by selecting his head and his body, and they're going to be the only two things that are going to move initially. We'll get to detailing other stuff later, but for now, let's keep things simple by just containing ourselves to two moving parts, which are actually quite a bit of work in themselves, seeing as on top of the head we have these plants which have to react to his motion. So as he propels upwards, they are going to, in response, shift downwards. Even though they're not particularly heavy, you can imagine that plant leaves they don't have a lot of weight to them, but still, as they are being driven upwards, they are going to deform and droop in response, and the motion is going to be most obvious at their extremities. So the very tips of the leaves are what we are going to see move the most of all, and as we get down towards the core body of the plant, you're going to notice that it doesn't move that much at all, because that's where the bulk of the structure is anchored. Oh, fine. Let's see an example. That's right, it's time to make this plant dance. And you may notice that the center of the plant stays motionless while the fronds themselves do most of the moving. Good work, Jim. Yes, I suppose that will have to suffice. One thing that I should mention at this point is that I'm shooting for around 6 frames total in this animation. I don't think it needs to be much longer than that to complete the motion and return to the starting position. We could, of course, do more and make the animation super smooth, but I think to get the general idea across and for the sake of speed and economy, 6 frames seems kind of perfect. So, of course, that means brevity is the name of the game, so we have to get in and out. And as you can see, I have reached the peak of the motion by frame 4, which means we have 2 frames to get back to the baseline. But one interesting thing to note here, however, is that the faster the motion is, generally, the fewer frames it should take to complete. So his spring up, it may seem like it's taking 4 frames to happen, but actually, if you remember, we have the first 2 frames of him sort of crouching. And then it only really takes him 2 frames to get to the highest point of his bounce, at which point we have to descend again. So really what we're looking at is, it's basically 4 frames of descent, and then 2 frames of bounce back to the top, which does kind of fit my mantra of the higher the speed, the fewer the frames. Once I was satisfied with this rough initial motion of the body moving up and down, I started working on the hands and arms. And what I was really looking for, again, was this kind of piston motion, where the hands sort of move down and thrust as if they're giving lift to the rest of the body. And to do so, they need to be a little fleshier, so to speak. They need a little more material to work with because they're looking a little spindly. So I buffed them up a little bit, and now, like Russian robot, he big and strong and ready to bounce his way to gold medal. No drug involved, no drugs. Anyway, I also want to tinker a bit with these upward thrusting frames again and really get a sense of exaggerated motion in there, and that means stretching things a little bit. Now he, as a robot, is not an organic object and should not stretch. However, within the magical bounds of animation law, you are permitted to do whatever you want to get the motion looking as good as possible. And I really think this robot needed to stretch, because exaggeration is always the name of the game for making things look fun. The way to do that is literally just to grab half of his head, pull it upwards, and duplicate 1 row of pixels, and this gives him a very stretchy look. Now, I did make a slight boo-boo here because I tried to do it on the downward motion, and that ended up looking quite wonky, so I undid that and I kept the stretching to the upward part of the animation only. Which kind of makes sense, because stretching is really only necessary when you're at the fastest part of the motion. It's almost simulating motion blur is what it's doing. So there you go, I think that's the justification for stretching an inorganic object, is to simulate some motion blur. Now this little spring in between his body is what's driving all this motion, and I kind of wanted that to look like it was uncoiling as he rose up. This turned out to be quite difficult to do, and you'll see me tinkering with it quite a bit. But basically what we end up with is kind of like a car jack. If you've ever seen a car jack where you sort of wind it and it rises up, that's kind of the mechanism I was going for here, just acting much faster. I'm gonna go quiet here, which is something novel for me, and just let you watch things happen so you can see sort of how things come together. I'll be back shortly. That was kind of relaxing. When designing sprites like this and animating them, I've always kind of said that it takes sort of 10% creation, 90% tweaking. And that is absolutely the case here. You know, with blocking out the sprite, it didn't take that long, but then detailing it took a long time. Maybe you couldn't tell because the video was sped up to 3000%. But yeah, it takes a while. Animation is also the same, of course, and it's just a matter of going back and forward between frames, tweaking things until you get things looking good. And, you know, one of my golden rules is that you should never be afraid to throw your weight around when it comes to animating. Try things, experiment, do something rash, because chances are that, you know, one of your experiments will look awesome and then you end up with a much better result. Maybe I should add at this point that saving is a good idea before you do anything too extreme. The final thing I'd like to do is actually the inverse of stretching, and that's squashing. So I'm going to smush his head when he goes into that crouch. Just before he springs up, he's going to smush a little bit. And once again, that's just to add some more exaggeration, to really get some kind of cartoony motion into this. Speaking of which, let's go a little further. Let's grab his chin, smush it down one more pixel, and haha! That's it. That's looking much better now. And at this point, I think it's worth taking a step back to see where we've come from. And here we are. Our initial sprite was looking kind of, well, pretty basic, but bit by bit we polished him up, and we ended up with a result that looks a lot more professional, I think. Is it game ready? Well, if you're like me, you'll probably spend another 20 hours tweaking it. But for now, it's time to sum up this little project. And here we are. One by one, our little frames came together to create a bouncy little robot. I'm quite satisfied with how he came out, actually. He's quite a joyful little fellow, and he might look good in any number of games. Here's him in a desert, for example. What a joy. Well, there we have it. It's always quite remarkable seeing those small piles of pixels come to life on your canvas right before your very eyes. In any case, if you liked this episode, please smash that like button to show me some love, or subscribe to see more episodes like this coming your way very soon. Until next time, thanks for watching. I'm Jimzip. Bye.